At 19 years old, Ava Bennett had nowhere left to go. She had aged out of foster care just over a year earlier, picked up whatever jobs she could find, and tried to convince herself that things would eventually get better. But life seemed determined to prove her wrong. First, she lost her job at a small roadside diner. Then she couldn't afford the rent. Within days, everything she owned fit inside the back of an aging hatchback that had become both her transportation and her bedroom. Most people in her situation would have spent every remaining dollar on food, gas, or another week in a cheap motel. Ava did something no one could understand. At a government auction held by the Forest Service, she spent almost every dollar she had left, $150, to buy an abandoned fire lookout tower sitting alone on a mountain ridge. The auctioneer stared at her twice before accepting the bid. Several contractors laughed. One man whispered to his friend, "She just bought a pile of rotten lumber." Another shook his head and said, "That tower will fall down before winter." Standing there with the signed paperwork in her hands, Ava wondered if they might be right. The stairs creaked. The windows were cracked. The radio equipment had been stripped out years ago. The place looked as forgotten as she felt. But on her very first night inside the old lookout, as the wind howled through the surrounding pines, she heard something, a slow, steady, metallic tapping coming from the abandoned radio room upstairs. The tower had supposedly been empty for decades. There shouldn't have been anyone there. There shouldn't have been anything moving. And what Ava eventually discovered hidden inside that forgotten lookout would uncover a piece of history that an entire community had unknowingly left behind. But before we go back to the day Ava climbed that mountain for the very first time, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city or country are you in? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below and say hello. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel around the world. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden history, and ordinary people discovering extraordinary legacies, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next adventure. Whether you're starting your morning, taking a break during the day, or winding down before bed, I hope you're having a wonderful day. And thank you for spending a little of it here with me. Now, let's go back to the morning 19-year-old Ava Bennett unknowingly changed her life forever. Text. Ava Bennett had learned long ago that losing a place to sleep hurt less each time it happened. Foster homes had come and gone throughout her childhood, each one teaching her not to unpack completely because nothing lasted forever. But sitting behind the steering wheel of her aging hatchback at 19 years old, she realized there was one kind of homelessness no one had prepared her for. This time, there was nowhere else to go. 2 days earlier, she had been carrying plates through the crowded dining room of a small roadside diner, smiling politely even when customers barely noticed her. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep a tiny rented room above an old hardware store. Then business slowed. Hours were cut. A week later, the owner gathered the staff together with tired eyes and apologized. He could only afford to keep 2 servers. Ava wasn't one of them. She thanked him anyway before walking out with her final paycheck folded inside her jacket pocket. She told herself she'd find another job before rent came due. She believed it right up until her landlord quietly changed the locks. He wasn't cruel. If anything, he looked embarrassed when he handed her a cardboard box filled with the few belongings she had left inside the room. "I'm sorry, Ava," he said. "I can't keep waiting." She nodded because arguing wouldn't change anything. By sunset, everything she owned fit into the back of a hatchback that rattled every time she started the engine. She parked at a 24-hour grocery store that night, reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and wrapped herself in an old blanket. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while passing headlights painted brief streaks across the ceiling. Sleep came in short pieces. The next morning, she counted her money at a gas station. $158. That had to cover food, fuel, and whatever came next, while drinking the cheapest coffee she could find. Ava noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. One faded flyer announced a surplus auction held by the Forest Service later that week. Old maintenance equipment, retired buildings, decommissioned structures. She almost ignored it until a photograph near the bottom caught her attention. An old wooden fire lookout tower stood alone above a forested ridge. The caption beneath the picture was short. Abandoned. Buyer assumes all responsibility. Minimum bid, $150. Ava couldn't explain why she folded the flyer and slipped it into her pocket. Maybe it was because the lonely tower looked as if it had been forgotten by everyone except the wind. On auction day, pickup trucks filled the gravel parking area. Contractors examined trailers and equipment while collectors inspected old tools. Nobody paid much attention to the fire lookout listing. The auctioneer read through several larger items before finally reaching the tower. "Abandoned lookout structure," he called. "Opening bid, $150. Silence answered him. Ava looked around. No one moved. Before she could talk herself out of it, she raised her hand. $150. The auctioneer glanced at her, almost surprised. "Any higher bids?" A few people chuckled quietly. One man wearing a logging company cap leaned toward his friend. "That thing's one snowstorm away from falling over." Another laughed. "She'd have been better off buying the old dumpster." No one offered another bid. The auctioneer struck the gavel. "Sold!" As Ava signed the paperwork, even the clerk smiled sympathetically. "Good luck getting up there." She drove into the mountains that afternoon using directions printed on the property map. The narrow gravel road twisted through tall pine trees before ending at a small clearing. The lookout tower stood above it on heavy timber supports, weathered by decades of snow, wind, and summer heat. Paint peeled from the railings. Several window panes were cracked. The staircase groaned beneath every careful step she took. Still, the structure remained standing. Reaching the top platform, Ava unlocked the door with the key included in her paperwork. Dust covered nearly every surface. An old stove sat in one corner. Empty brackets marked where radio equipment had once been mounted. The silence felt enormous. Yet for the first time in days, she closed a door behind her and knew no one could ask her to leave before morning. As darkness settled over the forest, she unrolled her blanket on the wooden floor beside the windows. Wind pushed gently against the tower, making the old timbers creak. She listened to the sounds of distant trees until exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep. Sometime after midnight, a sharp metallic tap echoed from the room above her. Ava opened her eyes. She held her breath. A second tap came, slow and deliberate, followed by another. Somewhere inside the abandoned radio room, where every piece of equipment had supposedly been removed decades earlier. Text. Ava barely slept after the strange metallic tapping echoed through the tower. She remained wrapped in her blanket until the first pale light filtered through the windows, listening for another sound. None came. By sunrise, the forest outside looked peaceful again, as though the night had imagined itself. Even so, she climbed the narrow ladder leading into the small radio room above the main lookout. Dust covered every corner. Empty mounting brackets marked the wall where a radio console had once stood, exactly as she had noticed the day before. There was nothing loose enough to explain the steady tapping she had heard. She examined the windows first. One latch had broken years earlier, allowing the wind to push gently against the frame. She tested it several times. It rattled softly, but the sound was lighter than the metallic knocks that had awakened her. The old chimney pipe vibrated slightly in the breeze, but again, it didn't match the rhythm she remembered. Eventually, she accepted that she wasn't going to find an answer that morning. The tower needed more practical attention anyway. She spent the next several hours sweeping decades of dust from the floor, carrying broken boards outside, and removing bird nests that had collected beneath the roof overhang. Every small improvement made the place feel a little less abandoned. Around midday, she unfolded the property documents that had come with the sale. Tucked inside the folder was a simple floor plan of the lookout. The drawing showed the observation room, the storage closet, the radio room, and the staircase. At first, everything appeared normal. Then Ava frowned. Standing inside the radio room, she measured the distance between two walls with an old tape measure she found in her car. The room was nearly 3 feet shorter than the blueprint indicated. She measured again. The numbers remained the same. According to the plan, there should have been additional space along the back wall, but no doorway or opening existed there now. She stared at the wall for several moments before running her hand across the weathered wooden boards. Nothing felt unusual, yet the measurements refused to agree. Curious. She continued cleaning around the old radio mounting area. Most of the equipment had clearly been removed years ago, leaving only empty bolt holes and faded outlines where machines had once rested. But one detail caught her attention. A thick cable still emerged from the floor beside the wall. Instead of ending where the radio should have been, it disappeared through a small opening behind the wooden paneling. Someone had removed the equipment, but left the cable behind. Ava crouched for a closer look. The outer covering had aged, but it was still intact. She gently tugged on it. It didn't move at all. Whatever lay behind the wall held it firmly in place. That afternoon, a pickup truck climbed the narrow mountain road and stopped beside the tower. A tall man carrying a toolbox stepped out and looked up with an amused smile. "You actually bought it," he called. Ava climbed down the stairs to meet him. "Apparently I did." He introduced himself as Noah Carter, a carpenter who occasionally repaired cabins in the area. "Word travels fast around here," he admitted. "People have been wondering how long you'd last before giving up." Ava laughed quietly. "I'm still here." Noah walked around the base of the tower, examining the support beams and staircase with an experienced eye. "Honestly, it's in better shape than I expected. It'll need work, but it's solid." Ava showed him the blueprint and explained the measurements that didn't match the room upstairs. Noah studied the drawing before climbing into the radio room himself. He measured the same wall twice, then compared the numbers with the plan. "You're right," he said. "Either someone changed the layout years ago, or this drawing isn't accurate." Before leaving, Noah tightened several loose bolts on the staircase and replaced one cracked step with a spare board from his truck. "No charge," he said when Ava thanked him. "I'd rather see someone save this place than watch it collapse." His kindness stayed with her after he drove away. It had been a long time since anyone had helped her simply because they wanted to. The following morning, she drove into the nearby town to learn more about the tower's history. The small public library sat beside the old courthouse, its brick walls shaded by enormous oak trees. Inside, she introduced herself to the librarian, Grace Holloway, a woman in her 70s with warm eyes and silver hair tied neatly behind her head. "You're the young woman who bought the old lookout," Grace said with a gentle smile. "I've heard quite a bit about you already." Ava smiled back. "I was hoping to find some old records." Grace led her to a section devoted to local history. Together they searched through photographs, forestry reports, and newspaper clippings about the Mountain Lookout Network. There were articles celebrating new towers, reports on wildfire seasons, and photographs of rangers standing proudly beside radio equipment. But when Ava asked for engineering records and communication files, Grace hesitated. "That's the strange part," she admitted. "Many of those records disappeared after the lookout system was closed. I've searched for them myself over the years." Later that afternoon, back inside the tower, Ava returned to the radio room. Kneeling beside the old cable, she brushed away more dust from the baseboard until she found the narrow hole where it disappeared. Instead of running straight downward as she expected, the cable turned sharply and vanished behind the wooden wall exactly where the blueprint insisted extra space should have existed. Text ID equals, quote, M1K9RP, quote. The cable disappearing behind the wall stayed in Ava's thoughts all evening. She sat beside the small wood stove, eating canned soup while studying the faded blueprint spread across the floor. Every measurement she had taken matched the drawing except for one section of the radio room. According to the plan, there should have been nearly 3 extra feet beyond the rear wall. Instead, solid wooden paneling stood where empty space ought to have been. She traced the missing section with her finger several times before folding the paper away. By morning, she had decided there was only one sensible thing to do: learn everything she could before removing a single board. Grace Holloway welcomed her back to the library with another stack of local history books already waiting on a table. "I thought you might return," she said with a smile. Ava laughed softly. "Was it that obvious? People who become curious about old places rarely stop after one visit." Together, they spent hours sorting through forestry reports, ranger newsletters, and newspaper archives dating back more than 60 years. Ava quickly noticed something unusual. Every annual report included summaries from the Fire Lookout Network, but the final months before the towers were retired seemed incomplete. Entire sections simply ended. Daily observations were carefully recorded through late summer. Then the reports skipped ahead to closure notices with no explanation. "Do you see this?" Ava asked, sliding one binder toward Grace. "There should be weeks of entries here." Grace adjusted her glasses. "You're right." They checked another year. The same gap appeared, then another. Different towers, different dates, identical missing pages. It wasn't a printing mistake. Something had been removed. Grace opened an inventory list from the old forestry archive. Most communication logs were listed individually, but several entries had been crossed out years earlier in faded pencil. Beside them, someone had written, "Records unavailable." Ava frowned. Unavailable because they were damaged? Grace slowly shook her head. "I honestly don't know." She looked disappointed more than confused. When the lookout system closed, a great deal was moved into storage. Some materials simply stopped appearing in the catalog. Before Ava left, Grace unlocked a large, flat drawer containing oversized engineering maps. Most showed hiking trails, ranger cabins, and lookout locations. One older blueprint immediately caught Ava's attention. It showed her tower in far greater detail than the auction paperwork. She carefully measured the dimensions printed beside the radio room. There it was again, a narrow compartment behind the rear wall. Unlike the newer drawing, this one clearly outlined a small, enclosed space. Excited, Ava searched for the next page listed in the blueprint index. The folder should have contained detailed construction notes for that compartment. Instead, the page had been neatly torn away, leaving only the binding holes along one edge. Grace stared at the empty space. I've never noticed that before. Ava gently touched the rough paper fibers. Someone wanted this page gone. Neither woman spoke for several moments. The silence inside the archive somehow made the missing page feel louder. Later that afternoon, Ava returned to the lookout carrying photocopies of the old blueprint. Noah Carter happened to be repairing a fence for a nearby cabin owner and stopped by after seeing her truck. She spread both drawings across the observation table. Look at the difference. Noah compared the two carefully. Same building, different layout. Ava pointed toward the missing compartment. The old drawing includes this room. The newer one doesn't. Noah studied the measurements. Someone remodeled it, or covered it up. Together they climbed into the radio room. Ava measured the wall again while Noah tapped gently across the wooden boards with the handle of his hammer. Most of the wall produced a solid sound. One narrow section answered with a noticeably softer echo. Noah paused. Hear that? Ava nodded. It's hollow. Before either of them could examine it further, footsteps echoed from the staircase outside. An older man wearing a faded Forest Service jacket climbed into the room. His gray hair disappeared beneath a weathered ranger's cap, and years spent outdoors showed in the deep lines around his eyes. You must be Ava, he said politely. I'm Daniel Brooks. Used to work these mountains before the towers closed. Ava introduced herself while Noah stepped aside. Daniel glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the old blueprint. Grace told me you've been asking questions. Ava hesitated before speaking. I'm trying to understand why the plans don't match the building. Daniel looked toward the rear wall without surprise. For a long moment he remained silent, as though choosing each word carefully. Not every record from those days made it into the public archive. Ava leaned forward. Do you know why? Daniel slowly removed his cap. Because there were a few radio logs that were never supposed to be filed with the others. Ava's heartbeat quickened. Where are they? Daniel looked directly at her, sadness mixing with old memories in his expression. If they still exist, he said quietly. They were never placed in any library I've ever seen. Before Ava could ask another question, he gently placed his cap back on his head, thanked them for listening, and walked down the tower stairs, leaving behind more questions than answers. Daniel Brooks's words stayed in the radio room long after he disappeared down the stairs. Ava stood beside the rear wall, listening to his footsteps fade into the wind below, and felt the tower become smaller around her. A few radio logs that were never supposed to be filed with the others. The sentence sounded impossible and practical at the same time, which somehow made it worse. Noah tapped the hollow section of wall once more, lightly this time, as though the wood might answer if treated gently. You still want to open it? He asked. Ava looked at the faded blueprint spread across the table, then at the cable disappearing through the baseboard. Not by tearing it apart. Noah nodded. Good. Old buildings punish impatience. They started by clearing the radio room completely. Ava carried down a broken chair, 2 rusted cans, a cracked window frame, and a pile of dry pine needles that had collected in one corner. Noah removed loose trim around the back wall, placing each piece carefully on the floor so it could be reused if needed. With the room empty, the differences became easier to see. Most boards had darkened with age, their grain rough and silvered by decades of mountain air. But the boards across the rear wall were slightly smoother and a shade lighter, as though installed years after the tower was first built. Ava ran her fingertips across them. This wall is newer. Not new, Noah said, crouching near the floor, but newer than the rest. He used a small magnet to test for hidden nails, then mark each strong point with pencil. The pattern was strange. Instead of simple vertical studs, the fasteners framed a narrow rectangle about 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. Ava watched him work, her nervousness mixing with something close to hope. The tower had given her a roof when no one else had. Now it seemed to be offering a question only she could choose to answer. Noah opened his toolbox and pulled out a small handheld stud finder and nail detector. Let's see how much space is behind it. He moved the device slowly across the boards. Most sections gave predictable readings, but the center of the marked rectangle produced nothing. No stud, no brace, empty. He stepped back and met Ava's eyes. There's a cavity. The word made the room feel colder. Ava looked toward the empty brackets where radio equipment had once been mounted. Could it just be insulation space? Noah shook his head. Not shaped like that. They removed the first board carefully with a thin pry bar. It resisted, then lifted with a dry creak. Behind it was darkness, not insulation. Ava held her flashlight close while Noah loosened the second board. Dust fell in soft gray strips. The air smelled trapped and stale, like a drawer opened after years in an attic. As more boards came free, a flat metal surface appeared behind them. Not a modern panel, not scrap. A small steel door sat recessed into the wall, painted dull green beneath the dust. Ava forgot to breathe for a moment. The door was real. The missing space on the blueprint was real. The cable, the tapping, the torn page, Daniel's warning, all of it pointed here. Noah brushed dust from the door with his sleeve. Near the upper corner, a small stamped symbol emerged. A lightning bolt crossed with curved radio waves. Beneath it were faded letters Ava could barely make out. Forest Service Communications. Radio room, Noah murmured. But hidden inside the radio room, Ava knelt closer. A round lock sat at the center of the door, old but intact. The cable she had followed disappeared through a protected hole beside the frame. She touched the metal gently. It was cold, despite the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows. Can you open it? Noah examined the lock. Not without damaging it, and I don't think we should. That disappointed her, but she knew he was right. Destroying the door would feel like breaking the one fragile thread connecting her to whatever had been forgotten here. Instead, they photographed the panel, the symbol, the lock, and the cable. Noah replaced the removed boards loosely so the opening would stay protected until they knew what to do next. As the light began to fade, Ava stood alone in the radio room after Noah climbed down to secure his tools. The wind moved around the tower, slipping through cracks and making the old structure creak softly. Then came a faint sound from behind the loosened boards. One tap. Ava stiffened. A second tap followed, sharper and more metallic than the wood around it. It seemed to come from inside the steel door itself, from the hidden cavity where no one should have been, where no equipment should have remained alive enough to move. She stepped back, her hand closing around the flashlight, as the locked door waited silently in the wall. The second tap from behind the steel door kept Ava standing motionless until the wind shifted and the tower creaked around her. For one frightened moment, she imagined something alive sealed behind the wall. Then common sense slowly returned. Old metal expanded and contracted. Loose cable could knock against a bracket. Wind could travel through spaces nobody understood. Still, when Noah climbed back into the radio room, Ava's voice came out quieter than she intended. It tapped again. Noah looked at the loosened boards. then at the hidden door behind them. He did not laugh. That helped more than he probably knew. "Then we don't ignore it," he said. "But we don't break it open either." The next morning, Ava drove into town and found Daniel Brooks sitting outside the small Ranger Museum near the courthouse, repairing the strap on an old field bag. When she showed him the photograph of the steel door, his hands went still. "Forest Service Communications," he murmured. "I haven't seen that mark in a long time." "What was behind doors like this?" Ava asked. Daniel studied the photo before answering. "Usually equipment storage. Sometimes backup logs. Sometimes things the public never cared about until they were gone." He led her inside the museum, where faded photographs showed men and women standing on distant ridge lines beside lookout towers, field radios, and smoke maps. Daniel pointed to one image of a young woman wearing headphones at a radio desk. Eleanor Price. She worked communications through some of the worst fire seasons this forest ever saw. Ava leaned closer. "Was she stationed at my lookout?" "Not always, but she monitored the whole network. Lookouts weren't just people staring at trees. They were voices. One tower spotted smoke. Another confirmed wind, a dispatcher warned crews. And someone kept writing it all down." His voice softened. "Those voices saved towns that never learned their names." Ava thought of her own name, passed from file to file in foster care, rarely belonging anywhere long enough to matter. "Why would logs be hidden?" Daniel's expression tightened. After the system closed, most people thought the old radio records were routine clutter. But some operators kept separate emergency notes during major incidents. They weren't secrets in a criminal sense. They were working records. Too immediate, too messy, sometimes too painful for official reports. "Do you know where they are?" Daniel looked away. "No. But if that door has the communications seal, it might have held something worth protecting." Later that afternoon, Daniel came to the lookout with Ava and Noah. The climb left him breathing harder than he tried to show, but when he reached the radio room, he stood straighter. Dusty light fell across the exposed steel door. Daniel placed one palm near the stamped symbol without touching the lock. "This was built by people who believed records mattered," he said. Noah examined the round lock again. "It's not a standard cabinet lock. Old, but precise." Ava crouched beside him and noticed faint scratches around the keyway, half hidden beneath grime. "What's that?" Noah cleaned the area gently with a soft cloth. Several deep marks appeared, crossing the metal in short, angry lines. Someone had inserted the wrong tool, maybe more than once, and tried to force the mechanism. The lock had held. Daniel's face darkened with memory. After the network closed, a lot of equipment disappeared. Radios, batteries, even maps. Some people thought old government property meant free salvage. Ava touched one scratch lightly. "Someone tried to get in." "And failed," Noah said. He tested the hinges and frame without forcing anything. "The door's solid. If we cut it, we could damage whatever's inside." Ava already knew what he was asking without saying it. They needed a key, and no one seemed to know where it had gone. Daniel removed his cap and turned it slowly in his hands. There were master keys for communications compartments. Operators carried them. Rangers sometimes had copies. When the towers closed, most were turned in or lost. "Did Eleanor have one?" Ava asked. Daniel looked toward the window where ridges folded blue into the distance. "Maybe. She was the last person I knew who treated those logs like they were people, not paperwork." Hope rose so quickly in Ava that she forced herself not to trust it too much. "Can I meet her?" Daniel hesitated. She's old now. Some days are better than others, but I'll ask. As evening settled, Noah replaced the loose boards again to protect the steel door. Ava remained in the radio room after the others left, looking at the scratches around the lock and the cable disappearing beside the frame. The hidden compartment no longer felt like a strange trick of construction. It felt like a sealed memory. Someone had tried to open it and failed. Someone else had built it strong enough to resist. And somewhere, perhaps, the last key to the forest's forgotten voices still existed. Text ID equals, quote, V3NK8M, quote. For the first time since buying the abandoned lookout, Ava stopped thinking about what might be hidden behind the steel door and started thinking about how it had once been used. If the compartment had belonged to the communications system, then whatever remained inside had depended on power. The cable disappearing through the wall had been left there for a reason. It had survived when the radio itself had been removed. The next morning, she climbed onto the roof with Noah to inspect the old antenna mast. The steel tower above the lookout leaned slightly but remained firmly bolted in place. Most of the antenna elements had rusted away, yet the main feed cable still ran downward through a weatherproof fitting into the radio room below. Noah traced it with his hand. Whoever dismantled this didn't bother pulling the cable. Maybe they couldn't, Ava replied. They followed the cable back inside the lookout. Instead of ending behind the radio brackets, it disappeared beneath the floorboards near the hidden steel door. Ava removed a loose inspection panel already missing 2 screws. Inside, the cable continued downward between the wall studs. Noah shined his flashlight deeper into the opening. There's another junction below. They climbed beneath the lookout to the storage space formed by the tall timber supports. Most of it was empty except for broken shelves, old fuel cans, and rotting crates. Near one support post, partly hidden behind stacked boards, Ava noticed a small metal cabinet mounted against the framework. Leaves and pine needles had collected around its base for years. She brushed them away until a faded label became visible. Auxiliary power. Noah crouched beside her. That wasn't feeding lights. The cabinet door refused to open at first. Rust had welded the hinges almost shut. Noah sprayed penetrating oil into the joints while Ava cleaned dirt from around the latch with an old paintbrush. After several careful attempts, the handle finally gave way with a long groan. Inside sat an electrical box surprisingly free from moisture. Thick ceramic fuses lined one side beside cloth-covered wiring that disappeared upward into the lookout. Dust coated everything, but nothing appeared broken. Ava stared at the arrangement. It's still complete. Noah nodded slowly. Looks like somebody shut it down instead of ripping it out. Remembering her basic electrical safety training from high school shop class, Ava resisted the urge to touch anything immediately. Instead, she inspected the wires for cracked insulation, loose connections, or burn marks. The age showed, but the workmanship impressed her. Whoever had built the system expected it to last. Noah pulled a small multimeter from his toolbox. Let's see if anything's alive. They tested one terminal after another. Most showed nothing. Ava had almost convinced herself the entire exercise would end in disappointment when Noah looked up in surprise. Hold on. He touched another contact. A faint reading appeared. Tiny, but unmistakable. There's still a little voltage here. Ava frowned. How is that possible? Noah traced the wiring. Could be a backup line that was never completely disconnected. Not enough to run equipment, but enough to tell us the circuit still exists. Along the bottom of the cabinet, One ceramic fuse sat slightly crooked, as though someone had removed it halfway before changing their mind. Noah examined it carefully. "Think it belongs here?" Ava hesitated. "Is it safe?" "As long as nothing's damaged and we don't force it." He looked at her. "Your decision." She thought about the empty radio brackets, the sealed steel door, Daniel's stories about forgotten operators, and the strange tapping that had awakened her the first night. Every clue pointed toward the same hidden system. She nodded. Together they cleaned the contacts with a small wire brush. Noah pressed the ceramic fuse gently back into its socket until it seated with a quiet click. They waited. Nothing happened. Ava almost smiled at her own expectations. Then, somewhere above them inside the lookout, came a faint electrical hum. It lasted no more than 2 seconds before fading away. Noah immediately climbed the stairs 2 at a time, Ava close behind. They hurried into the radio room. At first, everything looked exactly as before. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. The hidden steel door remained locked behind the loosely replaced boards. The old radio brackets sat empty. Then Noah pointed toward the corner where the original communications console had once stood. High on the wall, nearly hidden beneath years of dust, a tiny round indicator lens glowed pale amber for the briefest moment, before going dark again. Ava stared at the spot in disbelief. "Did you see that?" Noah nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the wall. Something answered. The room fell silent once more, but neither of them moved. Somewhere behind the locked steel door, the forgotten communication system had responded just long enough to prove it had never completely fallen silent. The amber light had glowed for less than a heartbeat, but Ava carried it with her for the rest of the day, like a small flame protected in both hands. It had not solved the locked door or explained the missing logs, yet it proved something inside the lookout still had a path back to life. That evening, Daniel Brooks called from town. His voice sounded careful, as though he had spent hours deciding whether to make the call at all. "Eleanor Price agreed to see you," he said. Ava sat straighter on the edge of her blanket. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll take you." She wanted to ask a dozen questions, but Daniel added only one more thing before hanging up. "Be patient with her. Those radio days are not stories to her. They are people." The next morning, Ava washed in cold water from a jug, brushed dust from her jacket, and drove down the mountain before sunrise. Daniel was waiting beside the Ranger Museum in his faded Forest Service cap. He climbed into her car slowly and directed her to a small house near the edge of town, where wind chimes hung from the porch and pine cones lined the garden beds. Eleanor Price answered after the second knock. She was 84, small and straight-backed, with white hair pinned neatly behind her ears. Her eyes were clear, but tired in a way that made Ava lower her voice before speaking. Daniel introduced them. "This is Ava Bennett. She's the one who bought Ridgeview Lookout." Eleanor studied Ava for a long moment. "You slept there?" Ava nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you've heard how the wind talks through those windows." Ava almost smiled. "And maybe something else." Eleanor let them in. Her living room held shelves of books, framed forest photographs, and an old radio receiver displayed beneath a glass cover. Ava noticed a pair of headphones resting beside it. The leather cracked with age. Eleanor saw her looking. "That was not from your tower," she said, "but it listened to the same mountains." They sat at a small kitchen table while Daniel explained the hidden door, the communications seal, and the brief indicator light. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Ava showed her the photograph of the lock, the old woman's fingers tightened around her teacup. I wondered if they sealed that compartment properly. Ava leaned forward. You knew about it? I knew some towers had protected storage. Emergency frequencies, spare parts, logs waiting for transfer. When the system closed, many things were packed in haste. Her gaze moved toward the window. Some records were easier to forget than to carry. Ava spoke gently. Daniel thought you might know about a key. Eleanor stood with effort and walked into the hallway. She returned carrying a small wooden box. For a moment, she simply rested her hand on the lid. I kept this because nobody asked for it, she said. Inside lay a cloth pouch, a faded frequency card, and one brass key darkened by time. The bow was stamped with the same lightning bolt and radio waves from the steel door. Ava felt her breath catch. Eleanor placed it on the table but did not release it immediately. If there are logs in there, they deserve respect. They were written during hard nights, by people trying to keep others alive with nothing but maps, smoke reports, and voices through static. Ava nodded. I understand. Eleanor looked at her with surprising firmness. Not yet, but you will. By afternoon, Eleanor insisted on coming to the lookout despite Daniel's concern. Noah met them at the base of the tower and helped steady her on the stairs. She moved slowly, pausing often, but when she reached the radio room, she touched the doorway like someone greeting an old friend. Noah removed the loose boards from the rear wall, revealing the dull green steel door. The scratches around the lock looked harsher in daylight. Eleanor's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Noah cleaned the hinges and lock carefully with a brush and a little oil. We should give it time, he said. Ava waited, though every second stretched thin. Daniel stood near the window, silent. Eleanor held the brass key out to Ava. Your lookout now, she said. You open it. Ava took the key with both hands. It felt heavier than it should have. She knelt before the door and guided it into the lock. At first, it resisted, catching against years of dust. Noah adjusted the angle slightly. The key slid deeper. Ava turned it slowly. Inside the mechanism, something clicked with a clean, decisive sound. Noah worked the hinges once, twice, then pulled gently at the edge of the steel panel. The seal broke with a soft crack. A narrow black line appeared. Cold air flowed out, carrying the dry smell of paper, dust, and old wood. Ava stepped back as the hidden compartment exhaled into the radio room for the first time in decades. The hidden compartment opened only a few inches at first, as though the tower itself was reluctant to surrender what it had protected. Noah steadied the steel door with one hand and eased it wider until the gap revealed a narrow space beyond the radio room wall. Ava lifted her flashlight. Dust moved through the beam like pale smoke. The compartment was not large enough to be a separate room, but it was far more than a storage cubby. It ran behind the full width of the radio wall, with low shelves built into both sides and a small operator's alcove tucked at the far end. Eleanor remained near the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, her face unreadable. Daniel stood behind her in silence. Careful with the floor, Noah said. He stepped in first, testing each board before allowing Ava to follow. The air inside felt colder than the radio room, dry and still, carrying the smell of old paper. Ava's flashlight moved across stacked boxes, cloth-wrapped equipment, coil-bound notebooks, folded maps, and metal tins labeled in fading ink. Some shelves held spare radio tubes wrapped in newspaper. Others held cracked headphones, frequency cards, signal forms, and small envelopes filled with typed slips. Nothing looked valuable in the way auction crowds understood value, but Ava felt as though she had entered a place where every ordinary object had been waiting to speak. On the left wall stood a compact radio set bolted to a narrow desk, its knobs dulled by dust but still intact. The main console downstairs had been removed, yet this backup unit had remained hidden. A cloth-covered cable ran from its rear panel into the same wall where the antenna line disappeared. Above it hung a laminated frequency chart. Ridgeview, North Spur, Bear Hollow, Elk Creek, Ranger Base. Ava read the names quietly, imagining voices crossing dark mountains long before cell towers or digital alerts existed. Eleanor stepped closer, her breathing shallow but steady. "We use those call signs every day," she whispered. "Some nights, every minute." Ava turned toward her. "You sat at equipment like this?" Eleanor nodded. "Sometimes here, sometimes at base, sometimes wherever smoke gave us no choice." Noah opened a wooden box on a lower shelf. Inside were field glasses, grease pencils, and folded transparent overlays used to mark fire direction on maps. Daniel lifted one gently and laid it across a wall map pinned inside the compartment. The overlay lines matched ridge lines, valleys, roads, and towns below. Ava saw how the lookouts had connected the forest into a living grid of observation and warning. One person on one tower could not see everything. Together, they could protect thousands. On a middle shelf, Ava found several official duty logs bound with twine. She opened one carefully. The entries were plain and precise. Weather, wind speed, smoke sightings, equipment checks, radio tests. Many pages bore initials rather than full names. Eleanor reached over and tapped one set of letters. "That was me." Ava looked from the initials to the woman beside her and felt the years between them fold in half. "You were here," she said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "We were all somewhere. That was the point." They worked slowly, removing nothing except to photograph it in place. Grace had taught Ava enough to understand that order mattered. Where an object had been found could be as important as what it was. Noah labeled each shelf with temporary tape, while Daniel recorded descriptions in a notebook. Ava took pictures until her phone battery warned her to stop. The hidden compartment held more records than any of them expected. Incident maps, shift rosters, weather strips, handwritten notes about lightning storms, lost hikers, dry lightning, and radio repairs. Yet as Ava studied the shelves, she felt the same unease that had followed her since the missing pages at the library. Everything here explained the Lookout Network, but not why Daniel had spoken of logs that never reached the archive. These were important, but they still seemed ordinary. At the far end of the alcove, beneath the backup radio desk, Ava noticed a narrow drawer with no handle. It was nearly invisible, hidden below a strip of trim darkened by dust. She might have missed it if her flashlight had not caught the faint outline. "Noah," she said softly. He crouched beside her and ran his fingers along the edge. "That's not part of the desk frame." Eleanor looked toward it, and something changed in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition arriving from very far away. Noah did not force the drawer. He pressed gently along the underside until a small spring latch clicked. The panel shifted outward a fraction of an inch. Ava reached for it, then stopped. Inside the narrow opening, wrapped in dark oilcloth, lay a book, separate from all the others, protected from dust and hidden where only someone who knew the desk would think to look. Daniel removed his cap. Eleanor closed her eyes. Ava stared at the wrapped volume, suddenly certain that the hidden archive had only been guarding the entrance to something deeper. Text ID equals, quote, Q8N4SW, quote. Ava did not reach for the oilcloth bundle immediately. The hidden drawer had remained unopened for decades. It deserved more than hurried curiosity. Noah understood without a word. He found a clean cloth from his toolbox and spread it across the narrow desk before carefully lifting the wrapped book into the light. Dust drifted from the faded fabric as though the compartment itself were releasing one final breath. Eleanor stood perfectly still beside the doorway. Daniel removed his cap and held it against his chest. Ava slowly untied the worn cotton cord securing the bundle. Inside rested a dark leather notebook, smaller than the official duty logs they had already found. Unlike the others, it carried no government stamp across the cover. Only 2 carefully embossed words appeared near the bottom. Radio log. Ava opened the first page. Neat handwriting filled the paper. Every entry began with a date, a time, and a radio call sign before describing short conversations between lookout towers scattered across the surrounding mountains. Smoke column confirmed. Wind shifting northwest. Jess additional crews. Notify Elk Creek. The entries were calm, precise, and deeply human. They were not dramatic stories written after the fact. They were voices captured while events unfolded. Eleanor stepped closer. "Those aren't official summaries," she whispered. "Those are working conversations." Ava continued turning pages. The notebook documented the final seasons before the Lookout Network had been retired. Operators had copied important radio exchanges by hand whenever emergencies became too complicated to trust to memory alone. Some entries ended with simple words like safe, fire contained, families evacuated. Others listed the names of rangers, volunteer firefighters, and lookout observers who coordinated through long nights until danger passed. Noah looked over Ava's shoulder. None of this made it into the archive. Daniel slowly shook his head. Official reports recorded outcomes. This recorded people. Ava paused at one especially worn page. During a severe fire season decades earlier, several towers had tracked separate smoke columns at once. The notebook preserved each radio exchange almost minute by minute as operators redirected crews, warned nearby towns, and shared changing wind conditions. There were no heroic speeches, only ordinary voices doing difficult work with remarkable discipline. Yet together they revealed how close several communities had come to disaster. Eleanor rested trembling fingers against the edge of the desk. "I remember that week." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Nobody left their radio." Ava looked at her. "You wrote some of these." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Some. Others belonged to operators who never expected anyone outside the network to read them." Near the back of the notebook, Ava found a folded sheet tucked between 2 pages. It listed every radio operator and lookout observer still serving during the system's final year. Several names had small pencil marks beside them. Eleanor pointed quietly. "Those are the people who stayed through the last major fire season before the towers closed." Ava recognized one name immediately. Eleanor Price. Another belonged to Daniel Brooks. Daniel looked away, uncomfortable with the attention. "We were just doing our jobs." Ava gently closed the notebook for a moment. "You saved towns." Daniel answered without looking up. We helped people save them. That distinction seemed important to him. Before moving anything else, Ava photographed every page exactly where it rested. Noah documented the drawer and hidden compartment from several angles. Daniel recorded the notebook's location in his own field notebook. Nothing left the tower that afternoon. Grace Holloway had taught them too well to separate history from the place that explained it. The following morning, Ava carried only digital copies of the pages to the library. Grace spread them across a large table beneath bright reading lamps. She compared names, dates, and incidents with the surviving forestry files already stored in the archive. The official reports matched the emergencies described in the notebook, but the conversations themselves appeared nowhere. "This explains everything," Grace said softly. Ava frowned. "How?" Grace opened an administrative memorandum from the year the Lookout Network had closed. It described how official reports, maps, and maintenance files would be transferred into the public archive. Working notebooks, draft communication records, and informal operating logs were listed separately as temporary reference material intended for departmental storage rather than permanent public filing. Grace looked up from the page. "No one ordered this notebook destroyed." She tapped the memorandum gently. It simply wasn't part of the archive transfer. Once the communications compartment was sealed and the people who knew about it retired, everyone forgot it was still there. Ava stared at the leather notebook resting beside the papers. For decades, the forest had quietly protected the voices inside it. They had never been classified, never hidden for scandal or profit. They had simply slipped beyond memory. Grace closed the notebook carefully and looked toward Ava with quiet wonder. An entire town believed those conversations were lost forever. They never knew this radio log was still waiting inside that old lookout. The discovery of the radio log changed the way people spoke about Ridgeview Lookout. For weeks after Grace confirmed what the notebook contained, Ava heard the same sentence again and again in town, spoken in grocery aisles, at the gas station, outside the library, and by neighbors who had once laughed about her buying a rotten tower for $150. "I never knew." No one said it proudly. They said it with the quiet embarrassment of people realizing something important had been standing above them for decades, waiting to be remembered. Grace took charge of the archival work with careful urgency. The original radio log remained protected in a climate-controlled case at the library, while high-resolution copies were prepared for display at the lookout. She cataloged each entry, matched call signs to tower locations, and connected names in the notebook to old payroll records, fire reports, and newspaper clippings. Ava helped whenever she could, though she often felt unqualified to handle history so fragile. Grace reassured her one afternoon while they sorted photocopies across the library table. "You don't have to be an expert to care for something," she said. "You only have to understand that it matters." Noah began repairing the lookout in earnest. He reinforced weak steps, replaced cracked railing sections, sealed window frames, and rebuilt the radio room wall so the hidden compartment could remain visible without being damaged. He refused to let Ava pay more than she could manage. "We'll call it a partnership," he said, tightening a bolt on the platform while wind moved through the pines below. Ava looked at the tower, then at the forest stretching beyond it. "A partnership in what?" Noah smiled. "Keeping this place standing." Daniel visited often, bringing old maps and correcting labels when Grace needed details only a former ranger would know. Eleanor came less frequently because the climb tired her. But when she did, everyone slowed down. Noah built a safer handrail for her. Ava kept a chair ready near the radio desk. Eleanor would sit there with the copied log open before her, reading the entries not like documents, but like voices returning through static. Sometimes she explained a call sign. Sometimes she remembered who had been on duty during a storm. Sometimes she said nothing at all. The town held a small reopening on a clear autumn morning. It was not fancy. There were no spotlights, no stage, no speeches written by strangers, just folding chairs in the clearing, coffee and paper cups, and a line of people waiting to climb the tower in small groups. Some had known the lookout only as a ruin on the ridge. Others remembered seeing it as children and wondering who lived above the trees. Ava stood near the staircase, unsure where to put her hands, while Grace welcomed visitors and explained how the hidden archive had been found behind the old radio wall. The first group included a retired firefighter who stopped in front of one copied page and grew very still. His father's name appeared in a radio exchange from a fire season long before Ava was born. The note was short, only a dispatch update confirming a crew had safely reached a threatened road. But the man touched the glass as though it were a family photograph. "He never talked about that fire," he said. Eleanor, seated nearby, answered softly, "Most of them didn't." By midday, the lookout felt alive in a new way. Children studied the map of call signs. Local residents pointed to ridges they recognized. Former Forest Service workers compared memories. Grace had created a display showing how one lookout's smoke report could travel by radio to another tower, then to a ranger base, then to crews on the ground. People finally understood that the old structure had never been merely a cabin on stilts. It had been part of a listening network, a chain of human attention stretched across mountains. When Eleanor was honored that afternoon, Ava watched the old woman sit straighter than she had in weeks. Grace read the names from the final year operator list, including those marked in pencil inside the secret radio log. Daniel Brooks, Eleanor Price, others no longer living. The crowd stood quietly before applauding. Eleanor did not cry at first. She only looked toward the radio room, where the hidden compartment stood open behind protective glass. Then she covered her mouth with one hand, and Daniel reached for her shoulder. "We were just doing our jobs," he said, almost to himself. Grace heard him and answered, "And now people know what those jobs meant." As the sun began to lower, the crowd thinned. Noah walked the platform, checking that everything was secure. Grace packed archival gloves and display notes into a canvas bag. Daniel helped Eleanor down the stairs slowly, step by step. Before leaving, Eleanor placed the brass key in Ava's palm. "Keep it with the tower," she said. "Not hidden again." Ava closed her fingers around it. "I promise." That evening, after the last car disappeared down the gravel road, Ava climbed back to the radio room alone. The forest below had turned blue with dusk. Wind whispered through the pines, gentler now than on the first night she had slept there with nothing but a blanket and fear. The room looked different, yet not new. Noah had left the scratches in the steel door visible. Grace had insisted the empty radio brackets remain on the wall. The past had not been polished smooth. It had been allowed to show its age. Ava placed Eleanor's key in a small display case beside the copied radio log. On the card below it, Grace had written, "The key that reopened the hidden communications compartment of Ridgeview Fire Lookout, purchased by Ava Bennett for $150 and restored for the community it once protected." Ava read the words twice. Purchased by Ava Bennett for most of her life. Her name had appeared on temporary forms, intake papers, school transfers, and case files. It had rarely been attached to anything that stayed. Now it belonged to a place on a mountain ridge where forgotten voices had found their way back into the world. She moved to the old backup radio desk. Noah had safely rewired a small indicator circuit for display only, using the original amber lens that had flickered the day the system answered. Ava turned the switch gently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tiny light glowed, warm and steady against the dimming room. It did not transmit. It did not summon crews or warn distant towns. It simply shone, a small signal that memory had returned. Ava stood beside it as night gathered around the tower. She had bought the lookout because she was homeless and desperate, because $150 was almost all she had and somehow still not enough to build a life anywhere else. What she found was not wealth, not rescue, not an easy ending. It was a record of people who had listened when others needed help, who stayed awake through smoke and storms, who proved that even unseen lives could hold entire communities together. For the first time Ava could remember, she did not feel like a girl waiting to be moved along. She felt rooted. The wind touched the windows. The amber light glowed beside the secret radio log, and high above the darkening forest, Ava Bennett finally had a place that answered back. The greatest surprise waiting inside the abandoned fire lookout was never hidden behind the steel door. It wasn't the forgotten radio equipment. It wasn't the secret compartment. And it certainly wasn't buried treasure. The real discovery was a single leather notebook that almost nobody realized still existed. The secret radio log. For decades, people assumed the final records from the old lookout network had been lost forever. They hadn't. The notebook had never been classified. It had never been stolen. It had never been destroyed. When the Forest Service retired the old lookout system, official reports and engineering records were transferred into public archives. But the working radio log, the handwritten notebook operators used during active fire emergencies, was considered temporary reference material. It remained inside the hidden communications compartment, which was locked, sealed, and gradually forgotten as the people who knew about it retired or passed away. Time erased the memory, not the evidence. Inside those pages were hundreds of ordinary conversations, smoke reports, wind changes, crew locations, requests for water, warnings sent just minutes before flames reached nearby roads. There were no dramatic speeches, no unbelievable conspiracies, just calm voices making life or death decisions through static-filled radios. The notebook also preserved something official reports never could: names. The names of the lookout observers, radio operators, volunteer firefighters, and rangers who quietly coordinated across the mountains to protect towns that often never knew they had been in danger. Among those names was Eleanor Price, Daniel Brooks, and many others whose work had disappeared from public memory. The abandoned lookout had never been hiding a secret meant to change history. It had been protecting the memory of ordinary people whose dedication had already changed countless lives. In the end, Ava Bennett didn't rescue forgotten history by accident. She rescued it because she understood what it meant to be forgotten. A 19-year-old with nowhere to live bought a crumbling fire lookout for $150. Believing she was purchasing nothing more than a roof over her head. Instead, she uncovered a place where forgotten voices had been waiting decades to be heard again, and in helping an entire community remember the people who had quietly watched over them from the mountains, Ava finally found something she had spent her whole life searching for, a place that remembered her, too.